Reverend Parker, thank you for those very inspiring and kind words. One of our commissioners appointed by President Obama is the Reverend William Shaw from White Rock Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, just appointed recently. And again, thank you for those kind words. Our commission, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, is an independent U.S. federal agency that monitors religious freedom worldwide and makes policy recommendations to the President and Secretary of State and Congress. The Commission is the only government body in the world with the sole mission of reviewing and making policy recommendations on the facts and circumstances of violations globally of freedom of religion or belief and other related human rights. The creation of the Commission is one tangible example of the historic commitment of the United States of America to religious freedom for all. And I think, being my first time in Austin, I had the opportunity just today to go to Salt Lick Barbecue. And on the way to Salt Lick Barbecue, you see several denominations of churches. But you also see a beautiful Hindu temple right as you're getting close to it. And I thought, this is what's great about America. You see such diverse religious communities all over the country. But the Commission does not use these American standards for freedom of religion or belief. Rather, it's the international human rights standards, and specifically Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 18 of the Declaration of Human Rights says, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." The term religious persecution typically brings to mind images of foreign governments preventing people from worshiping or otherwise mistreating people for their beliefs. But a second and equally egregious threat to religious freedom commonly occurs but receives far less attention. Many governments fail to punish religiously motivated acts of violence perpetrated by private actors. This breakdown in justice is known as impunity and has repeatedly confronted as a harsh reality in many places around the world which our Commission visits. When you take a brief survey of the world, unfortunately, you see that there's several diverse religious communities that suffer government repression or lack of government intervention to protect these communities. Whether it's the repression of Buddhist monks in China or Burma, the government imprisoning Jehovah's Witnesses in Eritrea and Africa, or Ahmadiyya and Sufi Muslim places of worship targeted by suicide bombers in Pakistan, Shiite and Ismaili Muslims facing severe discrimination in Saudi Arabia, or Coptic Orthodox Christians disenfranchised in Egypt, where you find 10 million people in the largest religious minority in the whole region. Or, on the other side of that, a lack of government intervention in sectarian violence between Christians and Muslims in Nigeria, or Sunni and Shiite violence in Iraq, which we've seen now for several years, or Hindu-Muslim violence in India. These are just a few examples of many where religion is either repressed by governments, or manipulated, or perverted by extremist private actors. Unfortunately, the results over generations can be devastating. For example, just as we're speaking now, this weekend the Vatican, the Catholic Church, is concluding 2 weeks of talks about concerns of the exodus and the deterioration of the Christian minority population in the whole Middle East region. The beginning of the 20th century, 20% of the population of the Middle East was Christian. Today, there are less than 10% of Christians living in the Middle East. Just an example of how, over time, this kind of repression can result in a change of demographics. With that backdrop, I'd like to now turn to Iran, the topic of this evening's program, and thank again the organizers of the Baha'i community of Texas and all the other co-sponsors who have brought to light the plight of prisoners of conscience in Iran. Those who have followed the human rights situation in Iran well before last year's election know full well that Iran is one of the world's egregious violators, as documented for decades by international non-governmental organizations, the United Nations, and governments throughout the world, including the United States government. In fact, Iran is one of the only countries where stoning is still used as a method to carry out capital punishment, and minors can still be sentenced to death. Journalists and bloggers are targeted, as are ethnic minorities, women's rights advocates, labor union activists, just to name a few. It's really staggering to see how many thousands of innocent Iranians from diverse backgrounds have been tortured and imprisoned and executed by the regime over the past 30 years. This includes those persecuted for their religious beliefs. The Iranian government is designated by the U.S. Department of State as the top state sponsor of terror in the world. And since 2009, the Iranian government has been responsible for dozens of killings and has imprisoned hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent demonstrators, opposition activists, and political dissidents. President Ahmadinejad, who just visited New York City last month for the UN General Assembly, used his platform to accuse the United States of being behind the September 11, 2001 attacks. He continues to deny the Holocaust publicly, and he calls for the destruction of the State of Israel, all in the name of protecting the Islamic faith, which he claims to represent. This is also a man who blatantly denies that there are any homosexuals living in Iran, or that his government has ever handed down a stoning sentence, as we learned in numerous press interviews during his recent visit. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon just issued a report on the human rights situation in Iran, just last month, and found that there was a dramatic increase in the charges and application of muharebe, which is a crime called waging war against God, and also spreading propaganda against the regime, two religiously inspired crimes, or at least the interpretation, the Iranian government's interpretation. But there were also other significant findings in the Secretary General's report. The Penal Code allows for amputation and flogging for theft and waging war against God. At least 25 people, mostly political prisoners, face death sentences on charges of muharib. And there's been a dramatic increase in the imposition of the death penalty, with record numbers of execution of 388 in 2009, 112 of which were carried out in the 8 weeks between the June elections of last year and the inauguration of President Ahmadinejad in August. Gender inequality and violence against women are pervasive in the country, and women are discriminated against in not only civil and penal laws, but in all the personal status laws, such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, and guardianship. There are women in prison right now who are involved in the Campaign for Equality, or the 1 Million Signatures campaign, which is solely aimed at ending discrimination against women in Iran. And then there's the case of Sakineh Mohammadi Ashtiani. Ms. Ashtiani faces a sentence of stoning for alleged adultery, a case that's received international attention. Despite a moratorium on stoning since 2002 and President Ahmadinejad's outright denial of such a sentence, stoning sentences continue to be handed down. And according to reports, 6 people have been stoned to death in Iran over the past 5 years. But thanks to this international campaign to overturn her sentence, Iranian authorities have recently temporarily suspended the sentence of Ms. Ashtiani. But her case remains very grave. There are also a number of other prisoners of conscience. It's not difficult to be able to name dozens, if not hundreds. Like Majid Tavakoli, a student activist. And juvenile offenders. There were 5 executions of juveniles in 2009. And currently there are approximately 150 juveniles on death row. Even worse, criminal liability for girls in Iran is 8 years and 9 months, and 14 years and 7 months for boys.